Kia ora. Welcome to Agility Matters, where we look at why adaptive organizations are leading the way in this new world that we're living in, why responding to the customer makes sense, and why being flexible in your approach is the only way. I'm going to have to welcome Dave Snowden today. We are going to have a good chat about adapting organizations, and we've looked at some of the comments already, some of the questions that come up. Obviously, you all want to know about the Connecting model. How do you use it? Why do you use it? How do people out there use it? What's updated in the last 10, 20 years? We'll get into all that, don't worry. But we do only have an hour. So let's welcome Dave. Hey, Dave, how are you?
Pleasure to be with you.
So Dave has just told me, I love this, that this is his third meeting today. And for those that know, it's actually 7 o'clock in the morning, Dave.
Yeah.
That's just, I love your dedication. That's just awesome. So we've had a good chat already, everyone online. So apologies, you've missed that. It was actually some really good chat. We chatted about politics. We got Connecting model in, we talked about going between complicated and complex. Can I bring that up again? Because that was a real insight for me. Because what I was talking about, guys, I was saying, hey, I liked COVID because it started off chaotic. It went complex here in New Zealand. It went to complicated. And I'm hoping it went to simple. And then you said...
I said, actually, that would make it more dangerous. And the simple domain is now called clear. And it's next to the chaotic domain. Because the danger is when you think things are simple or clear, that's when you're most at risk of disastrous failure. It's the complacency thing. And if you look at Cynefin, that boundary is drawn as a cliff. So it's kind of like, you walk up this gentle slope and you just keep on walking. And then suddenly you discover, like the old Roadrunner cartoons. Your feet are pedaling around because you're over the cliff and you're falling, right? So the stable dynamic in Cynefin is a constant oscillation between complex and complicated. So it's complex, we do parallel experiments, they work, we stabilize them, we make them complicated. We check that they're continuing to work. If they're not continuing to work, we cycle back into complex. And it's a cadence thing. It's like, I ride a bicycle, that's one of my hobbies, right? And if you go too slowly, you fall off. And if you go too fast, you fall off. But you've got to keep moving.
I thought that resonated with me. Did that resonate with you guys as well? I've always had that problem in my head. Like, when you become clear, that it would become almost, you become complacent, you would start to drift away, and you'd have problems later on. So I've always thought that was actually a concern of mine. I guess I'd always naturally thought it was a linear process, but the backwards and forwards.
I mean, the stable dynamic is literally complex, complicated oscillation, right? It gets more sophisticated when we bring in the central domain, but we'll come back to that later. Nice. Some things do go into clear, but they've got to be so stable for so long that they're not going to change. So New Zealand probably isn't going to change driving on the left any more than the UK is. So that's a nice, simple categorization problem. But for example, if you ever drive in Italy, south of Naples, north of Naples, you drive on the right. South of Naples, you flock. Yeah, you follow the next car, you match speed, avoid collision, ignore everything else because it's irrelevant. And then you can do stress-free driving even over the coast from Sorrento and the Orfini coast, all right? So it's interesting. Italian driving south of Naples and driving in India is a good example of a complex system. It's based on heuristics, which if you understand them, govern the system. So people sometimes say to me, well, I show a picture of traffic in Mumbai and say it's chaotic. And you say, it isn't. I've been to Mumbai. If I walk in a straight line at a constant pace, nobody will hit me. The system has worked out how to adjust.
I like that as well, because I've always had that weird thought, and I don't know if you've had that when you're starting to walk, right? You're walking through public and there's so many people, and Kiwis probably don't understand that. So, say again?
Yeah, and provided you keep a constant pace, the system adjusts.
As long as you don't make random moves.
That things go wrong, yeah?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I always remember, obviously being ex-British, when I was going to Oxford Circus and there is thousands of people, and you don't bump into hardly anyone.
Yeah.
And you're right, you bump into somebody when somehow your subconscious mind finds a variation in the pattern and then you don't know what to do. So I like that example, actually. That's quite cool. So for those who don't know, Dave, like, who are you? Where are you from? What are you doing? What did you do?
I'm from Wales. You can see from the Yes Cymru sticker behind me because I'm advertising that all international forums. My background is I did a degree in philosophy and physics. I worked on the in World Council of Churches for some years, and then went through a mixture of HR and accounting. And that got me into the early days of computing. So I'm old enough to remember punch card machines. And you have real discipline if you learn to program on punch card machines. You get a compile error in card 3, you learn to think. And I sort of decided what I wanted to do was to build systems rather than, be an auditor and do the treasury accounting and stuff like that. So I got a job as a programmer stroke accountant in a company called DataSolve, building decision support systems, and built them for people like Guinness and the Vesti Group and Merck. Yeah. So I was working at sea level when I was very young, talking with people who'd never had computers to help them make decisions before. And that's how I built myself up into general manager. Then IBM took us over. By that time I was strategy director, and then I was research. And then I left IBM and created Cognitive Edge, and that was based around the work with the US government on counterterrorism, which got picked up in Singapore. So it's kind of like an eclectic, semi-random walk, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I love it. And we have that in common, ex-accountants. I always had that debate, what's more boring, accounting or IT? I know, I'll do both. I think accounting's fun. I like accounting. I was a management accountant, so we got to see reports. That was fun.
Cool. Yeah, we used to have nasty cartoons about the statutory accountants who were considered boring.
Yeah. So what led you, because obviously I think at least 2/3 of our questions, Dave, were around a Cynefin model. So what led you to, I guess, create that model? What problem was it solving at the time?
It's actually about 21 years old. In fact, it was 21 years old this year. The guys put the book together. I didn't know they were publishing a book. They conned me into writing a chapter for it. I thought it was a web page. All right. So it kind of like starts. IBM had taken over the company I worked for, where I was in a strategy role, which was kind of like taking new ideas into practice. And we created a thing called the Genus program, which had put together legacy system management, object orientation, and RAD-JAD. And as part of that, I was one of the 3 people who set up the DSDM consortium, which was kind of like a pre-agile agile. Except because we were British, we did it over a meal in a pub in Cheltenham one night rather than going to a fancy ski resort. Yeah.
So you did it the right way.
Yeah. Well, also we did it between competitors. It was myself, my equivalent in Logica, who were deadly rivals, and Ed from Cambridge. We said, if we as competitors do this, and that's why we met in a remote pub in Cheltenham, so that none of our boards could see us doing it, then it becomes an international, and it did. I mean, it was one of the 3 key feeds into Agile. So either way, so IBM bought us and said, okay, here's some money, just go and do interesting things. IBM was still doing that in those days. And knowledge management was then the thing. And I got really frustrated with people who thought that you could codify knowledge. It's not that you can't, but it's fairly limited. To use a phrase I adapted from Polanyi, you always know more than you can say. You can always say more than you can write down. And so I started to heavily focus on tacit knowledge and things like experience. So that was one key component. And then I started to do work in IBM on communities. And it's really funny to see the Agile community rediscovering communities of practice 20 years later and making all the same mistakes, by the way, but never mind, that's the story. And one of the things I found is that the ratio between formal and informal communities in IBM was 1:64. And those were only the ones that used technology. It was actually much more if you didn't take account. And what I actually started to find is the informal communities are more important than the formal communities. That's where things actually really happened. And from a company perspective, the informal communities were a low energy cost. They had high redundancy, yet they could fail. And I wrote the first major Cynefin paper was on innovation, the first one which used the 5 domains. But then a couple of years later, I wrote one called Complex Acts of Knowing, which is now in the top 10 cited papers of all time on knowledge management, because it was the first one to introduce complexity theory. And it basically said the informal network is more important than the formal system. And you can't afford for it to happen accidentally, so you need to actually stimulate its formation. Something we're still doing. And then effectively the first Cynefin framework had bureaucratic communities, expert communities, informal communities, and crisis communities. Oh, and this interesting bit in the middle that I'm sure I'll think of sometime, and I'll get around to it. I more or less said that in the first article, is there is something here, but I'm not sure what it is yet. So that's where it started. Yeah. And it quickly migrated. It lost its access labels. It became a complexity framework. And I think one of the reasons Cynefin has had longevity, and it's a framework, not a model, by the way, that's an important distinction, is because it's actually adapted and changed through a mixture of theory and practice. It wasn't a one-time framework produced from a one-time study. It's been a co-evolutionary process between practice and theory.
Good, because that's one thing I do find. When I was doing my MBA, you read a lot of journals, and there's some amazing stuff out there. But it's normally a meta-analysis or a case study, comes up with a model or a framework, and that's it. It's never iterated, it's never continued. And what I do find from yourself is, I've read about you now over the last, probably for me, only about 6 years now. And over the last 6 years, I've seen it iterate twice, even just in 6 years. So that's just me. I'm sure you've iterated more than that, but for me, I've seen it twice.
It's actually fairly stable now. I'm moving on to other frameworks like Fletcher's curves and the entangled trios one. The big unresolved dilemma in Cynefin was the central domain, and that got resolved this April. Yeah, and that was critical.
So I had to ask, so why did it get resolved in April?
Well, more or less March. So I've got into the habit, all right, of every Christmas writing a series of Christmas blogs, which range from sort of polemical to serious to just personal. Yeah. So this year, I'll come back to the year before last, I did Sacred Places. And so that was personal. Yeah. This year, I actually decided I needed to define the field of naturalizing sense making, which is the broad term for what I do. And that is actually quite revolutionary, because we're not taking a case-based approach to the creation of frameworks. Yeah, that's quite deliberate. What we're actually doing is saying that you can't use cases to determine practice, particularly under conditions of uncertainty. And this is my physics background speaking. No social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion anyway. But what you can do is to use natural sciences as a constraint. So that's kind of like the principle. Yeah. And that links in with the other habit of every St. David's Day, which is March the 1st. Yeah, and Wales is the only country in the UK with a saint who's a native. And because we felt sorry for the Irish, we gifted them St. Patrick. And he was Welsh. So I sort of do an update on Cynefin on St. David's Day. And the big question was confused. John Van Breda, who's a colleague of mine at Stellenbosch University, where I've got a chair, said, I think you're talking about aporia, which is Derrida. So I dived back into Derrida, and he was right. So the central domain then became confused and aporetic. Yeah. And the aporetic side linked in with the liminal work I'd done the previous March. And so if you look at the current version of Cynefin, now it's complete. Yeah, there's no ambiguity left in it. It now more or less is there, I think, with some refinement.
Nice. No, I like that. And that kind of makes sense. And one of the questions was on specific parts of it that caused a bit of confusion. One question was around like what is actually disorder, and
so we got rid of that name.
Yeah, and that's why I thought I'd bring it up now, because obviously we're talking about the new names.
Yeah, there's an interesting sequence by which I explain Cynefin now. So you start off with the 3 fundamental systems, which are ordered, complex, and chaotic. I no longer use the idea of unorder. That's deprecated now. Yeah. Cynthia liked that in one paper and it sort of stuck, but I got rid of it because those three systems are actually have phase shifts between them. Right. So it's like latent heat. If I boil water to 100 degrees, it doesn't immediately become steam until I put more heat in. That's a phase shift. Yeah.
Yep.
So what you've got is those three systems, are distinct systems, and there's an energy shift to actually achieve a move between them. And if you know your basic physics, you'll know about the triple point, which is a balance of pressure and temperature, which means the system could become solid, liquid, or gas with equal valency. Yeah? Now that's actually the central domain of Cynefin. It's the point where you could move into any of those three. Right? So it's a triple point. Yeah.
Yeah. Like
and then Cynefin develops. So then the order splits into two, clear and complicated, which is not a phase shift difference. It's an ambiguous boundary because that's action based. And then the big thing I did in 2019, and you can see the build up. This built up over 2 years. Yeah?
Sorry, Dave. Is it the action taken by an organization that makes it clear or complicated, or is it the action based on a consumer?
It's more who you trust. So in the clear domain, everybody can see what the right thing is to do. In the complicated domain, you have to do analysis or call in experts.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's no issue in New Zealand in getting people to drive on the left. Well, there isn't. Sometime I have had the odd experience coming over the volcano drive between Auckland and Wellington, but in general, people will drive on the left. Yeah.
In general, there's two reasons why they wouldn't. 2 a.m. on a Friday night, never quite know. And there's a road actually down in Queenstown, a mine that was built by Americans, and they made it a right driving road.
Yeah.
Random bit of knowledge.
So, okay, I didn't know that.
Normally, yes.
I'm now getting curious. I shall have to seek that out next time I'm in the second time.
It froze you.
Either way.
Carry on, sorry.
So come back to that. So the key thing which happened in 2019 was the stabilization of liminal. And I got it down to a single line. The other principle behind Cynefin is, and this is true of any sense-making framework, you have to be able to draw it on the back of a table napkin from memory. Nice. Anything which looks like an engineering diagram isn't about sense-making. That's one of the reasons, one of 3 reasons I oppose things like SAFE, is they don't allow, the frameworks are just too complicated. Yeah, they look like sort of schema for distillation plants rather than anything else. Yeah. And a distillation plant at least produces something of some use, whereas SAFE doesn't. But that's another matter, right?
And I don't want to ruin your train of thought here, Dave.
Liminal.
Yeah, let me get back to you. I'll get back to you on my question about SAFE. Actually, carry on.
Okay, so if you look at what happens with liminal, all right, I got it down to a single line. So that created a transition between complex and complicated, and that resolved the issues about things like Scrum. Because Scrum is a hugely powerful collection of methods. It isn't a framework, it's a collection of methods, right? They may want to call it a framework, but it ain't, all right? I'm not a philosopher, we know how to use language, right?
I have this argument a lot, don't worry. Yep, carry on. It's definitely a method.
What Scrum is brilliant is doing is taking a degree of ambiguity and stabilizing it in short cycles. In Cynefin terms, that's liminal, complex to complicated, but it's not truly complex. In fact, one of the things we're starting to train now are pre-Scrum techniques, which are complex in nature. We also then created the liminal area into chaos, which is a closed loop, and that's where you use chaos deliberately for wisdom of crowds. Because remember, the mathematics behind wisdom of crowds is all the agents are separate, so you can actually use normal distributions. So that's what we do. Yeah. And then you got these 2 cute areas. One is this very small liminal area in complicated, which is where experts compete. So in COVID, for example, in Britain, they couldn't make up their mind whether to believe behavioral economists or epidemiologists. Yeah, so you know who the experts are, but you don't know which to believe. All right. So that's that domain. And then the central domain, which is now called confused, which Mary Boone has been arguing for years. So we have clear, complicated, complex, chaotic, and confused. So there's a symmetry there. If you're in the confused state and you don't know it, that's really dangerous. If you move into the confused state deliberately, and that's called the aphoretic state. And this comes from the Greek concept of aporia, which is deliberate confusion or paradox.
Why would you do that? What's the
Because
justification of
that
it.
means you keep your options open. So in the crisis, the first thing you do, which your Prime Minister did brilliantly, is you oppose draconian constraints regardless of the law to keep your options open. Thereafter, as a leader, you don't make any decisions. You delegate that, you coordinate. Yeah. So what she did was to shift from chaos into apparetic. Yeah. Now, once you're in there, you've got different movements. If you know what the hypotheses are, you construct safe to fail experiments. It's complex. If you know which experts to trust, it's complicated. If the experts are competing, it's liminal complicated. And we have techniques such as triopticons, which work there. If you're not sure you've got all the hypotheses, you move into the liminal area with chaos and you test for what we call finding the 17%, the people who are thinking differently or everybody's ignoring. So by moving into that apparetic state, you basically create a holding pattern where you can decide where to go for different aspects of the problem. Yeah.
I like that a lot.
That's kind of the resolution.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And it makes sense why you would do that as well. And that's kind of the main thing I was getting to, because when there's an action that one can take, you must have the reason behind it. I think a lot of times we do things because a book has told us or Safeguards told us, and we don't actually understand why we're doing it. So I like that understanding of why you would go.
As well, because once you move there, you can change the granularity of what you're dealing with. This is a key part of Kinevit, is you decompose to the lowest level of coherence. And then whatever you've got, you work on in different domains.
Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about the fact that the system as a whole has ordered and complex aspects. You start to look at it from different dimensions. And if it's complex, you stop trying to deal with it as a system. You deal with it by managing the constraints and seeing what happens, because the constraints are knowable.
Yeah, and that's one of the key reasons, especially in private organizations. And we'll get into public. We'll probably have a whole section on public, guys, because there's a lot of questions on public coming up. But in private organizations, that's to me where they're failing. They're trying to manage the system in a complex environment. And
I think it's worse than that. I call it the McKinsey phenomenon.
The what?
So when I was McKinsey phenomenon.
Yeah.
So when I was first in IT, nobody got fired for buying IBM. You could have better software and better hardware. In fact, everybody did. But it was too risky. And that's what. But then what happened is the management consultants came in, and their whole, because they have high utilization targets, their models are based on rolling out recipes every few years. Yep. So the industry has got into this habit, and regrettably government follows, of picking on a new recipe or an approach and just rolling it out and saying that will solve, the problems of life, the universe, and everything. And Dean's genius to come back to SAFE was to realize that's what companies wanted to buy, and they wanted the delight of calling themselves agile, but not really changing. And a nice big program, which would take 3 years, they could announce to shareholders.
Yep, and it's stable as well, mostly. It's something you can say, this is the strategy, this is what we're doing, this is the expected outcomes we're looking to achieve, this is the measurable results.
And you won't get fired.
Yeah, you're not going to get a promotion.
Right? And it's why failure rates have gone up in industry. I mean, I got really drunk once in Wellington. The New Zealand country general manager had a crate of Pinot, which he decided we should taste. And then we discovered we were both ex-accountants. So by 4 o'clock in the morning, there wasn't much of the Pinot left. And we'd gone through every IBM acquisition over the last 20 years and worked out whether IBM had added value. And it hadn't. IBM had got not very impressive growth by basically cannibalizing acquisitions. And that's where you are. Nobody's creating value.
I remember, Dave, I haven't been fired many times in my life or let go. And one of those was, I was at a company that was purchasing IBM products, and not software, the hardware side of things at the time. And I remember talking to them and saying, if we stopped selling IBM, we would make more money.
And if you'd used DECVAX, you'd have a much better machine than the AS400 anyway. Sorry, I'm coming back to my old prejudices.
Yeah, it was a very interesting, but a lot of people are ex-IBM. A lot of people have a lot of passion for the culture, and they still want to serve their old.
What McKinsey's do, they lay people off if they don't make partner. They go into industry. They buy.
Yeah.
What you've got is these parasitical systems, which I mean, I wonder where we're going to get the next Apple from, because actually companies don't have that sort of risk profile anymore.
No, but we got the current Apple and Facebook and Amazon from a startup. It wasn't an incumbent organization that transformed into something that was magical, right? So I wonder if our incumbents will just die out.
Flexus curves, all those three industries were created when the old industry was at the end of its life cycle.
Correct, yeah.
And therefore they moved. This is what we call apex predator theory or Flexus curves. When the old thing is coming to the end of its cycle, there's space for novelty, but then there isn't thereafter. And part of the problem you got, I mean, look at what Bezos did to the diaper.com. Yep. He basically drove them into bankruptcy, and he's done the same since. Yeah. Apple, interestingly, Apple are fascinating. They've decided that privacy matters, and they're taking on Facebook. And I think Apple, sorry, let me get into personal thing. Apple have always understood ecosystems. So you had IBM with hardware, Microsoft with software. Both of them came to the end of their cycle and broke because they were too dependent on commodity-based revenue. Yep. Apple realized that actually what you wanted is a working environment. And you couldn't care less if the hardware and the software came from one supplier. That was only something techies worried about, and you got fed up of techies anyway, because they liked systems that went wrong, because then they could be considered valuable and they could rescue you, right? And I think the other thing Apple has also realized, which is something I was arguing in corporate committees back in the 80s, is that people are objects too. So a modern organizational design is about what are your people units, what are your technology units, what are their input outputs, what's their inheritance factor, are they polymorphic? And organizational design is there for an emergent property. And technology is a part of that. And this is, I mean, the key thing Agile has got to understand, we're not any longer manufacturing to user requests. We're actually providing technologies for unarticulated needs. And that's where things like all of the current Agile techniques fail, because they assume the user can articulate their needs. And actually they can't.
No, and we've got to a point where I think, especially, I use the term big business. Big business used to think that eventually, I remember there's an article by Levin in 1994. He stated that technology will hit the plateau effect by 2000, 2001, and will be commoditized over that time period. I don't feel like technology has been commoditized since 2020 now.
It's interesting. Well, some parts are. It was interesting. I mean, users...
Hardware.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I grew up in... Well, even that's changing, right? I mean, I grew up in the early days of IT, as I said, all right? And my first job... So I applied for this job. I mean, the nice thing about being an accountant is you know when your company's going bankrupt before the CEO does. And yeah, myself and the financial director knew that. And he basically said I could carry on being his number two for life, or I could strike out. So I decided to strike out and became a consultant, right? Now, I didn't know they'd be looking for somebody who knew about computers and accounting for 2 years and hadn't found anybody. And I was the first person to turn up. If I'd known that, I'd have negotiated a higher salary. And they literally dumped me into this major UK company. I mean, this is major international, as an expert in software I'd never used in my life. Yeah, so
this sounds heavenly familiar. So we call it Mick Agile, Dave, over here.
Yeah, I actually call it deep immersion. We have this policy now in Cognitive Edge. You take new employees to the swimming pool, you throw them in the deep end, go and have a cup of coffee. And the ones who are still swimming when you come back are worth employing. I recommend this as a recruitment strategy, by the way. So either way, and I worked out if I told them they got it wrong, I'd have time to learn how to code it. So I told them they had it wrong and persuaded them we should go through the specification stage again. Yeah. Now I think for the next 2 years, and this became it was the most profitable account we ever had, because I kind of like listened to them, and then I did what I thought they should have asked me to do, not what they asked me to do. Yeah. And got that right. Yeah. And that was because the technology could do things they didn't know to ask for. And that process, if anything, is accelerating. So the big stuff we did on the complexity approach to design thinking, because if you look at what's happening with design thinking, that's becoming hugely commodified again. If I see that bloody double diamond once more, I will go insane. Is we worked on how
what's wrong with double diamond? I like double diamond.
How do you it's linear. How do you repurpose existing capability for novel
Yep.
use for unarticulated needs, and that's called exaptive innovation.
Mm.
And that's a big theme now of what we can do both in software. It's a big theme, by the way, in the coming EU field guide on how to manage crises, is you come out of a crisis by repurposing existing capability for novel use.
Yeah. But what I like about
You
you,
don't
Dave,
by inventing from scratch.
you're similar, I guess, to myself. And this is, I work for a company called Surge, and we focus on business agility. So I don't know if you like that term or not, but we like it. And we're trying to drop technology. We're trying to drop.
Agility has become the latest fad. It's like it used to be everything was lean, including coffee. All right. Now I'm waiting for somebody to set up the agile coffee moment.
Oh, there's always an agile coffee moment. There's always an agile coffee moment. No, so I personally like agility because it's a term that's been around for a very long time. It's adaptable, flexible, responsive organizations. I've always quite liked it. I agree. We added the term business on top of that.
In the 70s?
Say again?
Read Mintzberg. There's nothing new about being agile.
No, that's what I'm saying. So for me, agility's been around for a long time. The first documents I was reading were in the 1930s, and they were based off 1890s documents on how we can adapt to new changes.
Deming understood complexity more than is inherited.
Totally agree. Now, so Anastasia has said she likes your thoughts on Scrum and pre-Scrum, but she also asked a good question. Well, it was a statement actually, Anastasia, but I'll ask it as a question for you. Dave, do you think anyone who wants to do an agile transformation or agile adoption, that they should first understand Cynefin? And I'm assuming, Anastasia, you mean to whether they should go to agile or not. So two questions maybe in that. What do you think, Dave? Should they understand it before they make the decision?
I think you need to do sense making before you act. All right. So Cynefin is a sense making framework. And how do you find sense making is how do you make sense of the world so I can act in it. Right. So let me say what I think you should do and then say how Cynefin can help on that. So if you take the key thing about scaling in a complex adaptive system is you don't scale by replication or aggregation, you scale by decomposition and recombination. Yeah. If you think about it, the whole of organic life form comes from various recombinations of 4 basic chemicals in DNA. So if I look at, and so I think agile needs to be a multi-methods approach, yeah, and not a single framing.
100%.
So I can look at something. So let me give you 2 examples. All right. One of the techniques in the DSDM manual, which the agile people have all forgotten, which is hugely valuable. In fact, I've just finished producing a new training course for this that we're going to run out, is to use time boxes. Now, in a time box, you agree a minimal viable product and a maximum conceivable product range, and a minimal level of resource and a maximum level of resource, and you agree a delivery date. And the only thing which doesn't change is a delivery date. So the user has absolutely guaranteed that they will at least get the minimum viable product at the maximum cost on that date. And for projects, that's wonderful. Yeah.
Especially in a project or an organization.
A 3-month time zone or a 1-month time zone. Okay? Now, I can take, for example, I can take Scrum as a body of methods. I can decompose Scrum into its lowest coherent unit. So a retrospective is one, a sprint is another. And I can say, okay, well, I could modify the sprint to be a time box and make it 2 months. The whole thing would still work. Yeah. Or pre-Scrum techniques like trios, like forced mutation, yeah, unarticulated need mapping. And what I should be doing is combine, what I need is methods which have standard input-output. So I can combine them in novel ways. And I need an overall scaffolding. I mean, this is the future of architecture, is you choose a scaffolding and you allow people and software to interact around the scaffolding to create effectively emergent applications. Now, Cynefin is a framework that allows you to do that because it says, you know, Scrum works here, time boxes work here, here you need something different. Yeah, and it allows you that what we call requisite diversity, i.e. things with different backgrounds that can interact in different ways. And it allows you to have a multi-vendor strategy, yeah, rather than a single vendor strategy. And I say the problem with SAFE is that if I'm being really cynical, I've only been mildly cynical so far. If anybody wants to buy things, Dean will sell you a certificate in it and an annual update of slides. And everything gets a model. And they
it's only $300. It's only $300 a year, Dave. It's fine. It's fine.
And they put, I'm really satirizing, but I don't want Cynefin ever to appear on it, right? They put design thinking on it the other day. Yeah.
So for those who don't know, everyone, I've got a Cynefin course. It's only $99. It'll include this video afterwards. No, but I totally, I totally agree with you, Dave. Because so before we go on about safe, because I got some thoughts on that. There's a question. What are the two main things of what you don't like about safe then? Because you mentioned it, and someone, Mikesh Bra, asked, what are the two reasons why you don't promote safe?
I remember the first time I saw it presented at a conference in Poland, and I wrote a blog post very quickly. It was an angry blog post called The Infantilization of Management, which is still current and people still reference it. Yeah.
Nice.
Safe is wrong a priori. It's wrong before the facts, because it actually claims to scale something which is a complex system, and it does it in a complicated way, so it's wrong. The second thing is it plays to three weaknesses, all right? The desire, and there's a famous quote from T.S. Eliot on this, which I put in the blog post the other day, is that people delight in saying something they'll do, doing new, while carrying on doing the old thing. So it played the desire of executives to have a highly structured technique, but say they were being agile. It also played to the tendency of executives to have a 2-year implementation plan before they're expected to deliver value, which means they can claim the credit and move on. Yeah, and it created a huge industry which wants to self-sustain. It started off by selling with a pyramid selling scheme, if you remember. I mean, if you did the training course, regardless of experience, you could then sell the training course, provided you paid Dean a royalty. He's now trying to stop that because he says it's immoral. Yeah, that's to stop new competitors.
You can, but you can't do it online, because we tried to do a Scrum Master course online and got a court order come through. So yes.
Yeah, what's actually interesting, yeah, but I mean, Scrum is tearing itself apart with legal actions at the moment, and a lot of us are looking on with amusement at that, all right?
Yeah, I like Scrum for one reason. I'm normally brought in to fix Scrum, and the first thing I do is make the sprint one day.
Yeah,
and it really throws people.
I think the thing about Scrum, all right, is, and I think this. Remember, Scrum existed before the manifesto.
Of course.
And Agile would never have. I mean, XP is more authentic to the spirit of Agile, but it's insufficiently codified to allow Agile to scale. So I famously said at a conference in Scotland, I said, without Scrum, Agile would never have scaled, but it should have been based on XP. And the XP people cheered me. So I thought, I can't have this. And I said, the trouble is XP people can't talk to ordinary mortals. So nothing they do will ever scale anyway. And they're still trying to work out whether that's an insult or not. Ken thinks it's a compliment, all right, which I buy, right? I think the other big thing to realize about safe is when something comes along like safe, the movement is at an end. It's the classic sign of the end of a movement when it gets highly commodified, highly structured with one dominant player. And that means the space is there for something new. Oh, and by the way, it isn't Agile 2 or Agile 2.0 or Agile 3.
Modern Agile, Agile agnostic, business agility. So I'll give you a user. I was going to say a user story, but I don't mean that. I mean I'll give you a case. I believe safe scaled agile framework. They're using the play on words that agile has no meaning. So if we ignore the fact that scaled agile framework does not mean scaled agile, it just means safe, right? They've got a framework that I believe can help be a gateway drug to agile in the future. I believe you could implement it in a complicated situation like a government to give people a bit more empowerment and a structure that you can actually reflect out of safe eventually. What do you think?
This is the Trojan horse argument. And as I pointed out ages ago, you have to remember what happened to the Trojans. All right?
Okay.
And also what happened to the Greeks afterwards, all right? If you start it, I mean, the essence of complexity is you start journeys with a sense of direction, and how you start them determines how you end them. If you start with safe, that's how you'll end it. It's not a way of getting into being agile. You're much better. I mean, to be quite honest, there's nothing you can do with safe you can't do with Prince 2. Prince 2 has actually got an agile hook in it, and it's actually more structured. It's actually better, right? And it gives you adaptability. So you can have this mixture. The trouble is, safe fed into this sort of drive. I call it the Billy Graham phenomenon in management consultancy. And then and American management consultants have been fundamentally informed by that religious fundamentalism. All right, yeah, they expect everybody to come to the mercy seat, confess their sins, and take on the new faith, and safe plays to that. Right, and it's actually very dangerous because you're dealing with a complex adaptive system where you can't get it right up front. Safe only works because people don't use it, and Dean played to that. He knew that good agile people would make it work despite the structure.
100%. And that's one of the things that I think the first good safe consultant I ever met said to me, oh, we're not implementing safe out of the book. We're implementing what works for this organization and we're calling it safe. And I thought,
which is massively inefficient. And remember, it's exactly what happened with SAP.
Yeah.
Right? The ERP model, the Dean learned from that. And you've now got a problem where the upgrade time, the time it takes to update an ERP system, is longer than the market lifecycle change.
Yeah.
So actually, the structure means you're non-adaptive and you're not agile. Yeah, things like safe are the antithesis of agile.
But what about, because I notice you go back to complex a lot, right? What about in an actual complicated industry that's not complex?
No industry is fully complicated, just as no industry is fully complex.
Okay, I'll give you that. What about public? Because there's a lot of questions on public around how we use Connect model in the public organization. And I guess
let me give you a slightly related example, all right? So I was working with Telstra over in Brisbane, right? And they had waterfall projects because they're massive infrastructure projects. They're waterfall projects. But nobody got promoted unless they were doing agile. So they created 1-year sprints so they could say they were being agile, which I thought was very inventive of them, right? This is a nonsense, right? In the public sector, you've got infrastructure projects, where actually traditional things like PMI or Prince2 will do the job. Safe actually will do it less well than those techniques. Yeah. But then you've got all these complex issues, like you're putting in a public transport infrastructure project, and these are the ones which fail worldwide. And they fail worldwide because the models of the way that human beings behave are not accurate. Right? So that's actually where, and we're working with Transport Wales on this, we're working with other people. You need to understand people's stories about transport before you design the system. And this is this multi-methods approach, right? So the point is there are better, cheaper, more effective methods for the highly structured, complicated stuff. And they don't claim to do the complex stuff. Yeah, therefore you start in a much better place.
So let me ask you a question then. If you understand human psychology, right? And you mentioned just then, unless you're doing agile, you get sacked. And it kind of is going that way quite a bit. And I've been, people have a go at me on LinkedIn for saying, you could have a waterfall methodology and be agile. And I'll stand by that you could be very agile with waterfall methodology, especially if it's your choice. But safe sells. And it's very hard to implement Prince2 for agile in an organization, but it's quite simple at the moment to sell safe and implement safe and then adapt on that. So would nothing be better than safe, or would safe be better than nothing? I know it's a black and white answer, but
I remember I had that debate with Jürgen Apollo once, and he basically said, but I must be right because I'm selling. And I said, do you know anything about history? Right? Yeah. It's kind of like, that's ridiculous, right?
Okay.
So I think one of the things you've got to decide as a consultant, and the other thing is once something becomes as dominant as safe happens, it's going to go through catastrophic failure. So I can take you to 8 or 9 safe sites where they're not using safe anymore, but they spent so much money they daren't say it.
There's plenty of big organizations in New Zealand like
that's a phenomenon, right? The other problem you got with government is government can't, industry goes through this cycle and goes bankrupt. That's what happens in industry. Governments can't afford to go bankrupt. Yeah, and the trouble is governments can instantiate failing systems longer. So balanced scorecards, which were always a bloody nonsense, all right? Industry worked that out fairly fast. Governments are still using them because the bureaucracy instantiates them. So introducing safe to government is actually even more dangerous than introducing it to industry because there isn't the evolutionary pressure to kill it off fast enough. But there will be another movement, all right? And you can see that this is what happens. Don't need an ERP anymore, all right? It's that's past, all right? These movements cycle. What I'm passionate about, and I think this is what good consultants who have any ethics, is to break the fad cycle. Because that came in the 80s. And interestingly, it came in the 80s on the back of systems thinking, which is not the same thing as complexity.
Yeah.
And what happened with systems thinking is the adoption of an engineering metaphor. And of course, engineers like plans and goals and objectives. Yeah, we're now switching over to an ecological metaphor of the firm. Yeah. And the one thing COVID will do is it will break things like SAFE because they will not be adaptive enough to the new future. So you want to be a consultant moving to a new area.
Yeah, I haven't seen. I mean, people say the reason why I don't promote SAFE is because I'm not a seller of SAFE, so therefore I don't know enough about it. But so I try not to bag SAFE too much because maybe I don't know enough about SAFE to actually.
They tried that on me as well. They said, "Come on the SAFE course and you'll understand it." And I said, "Well, that's what the neuro-linguistic programming people say. Come on the 3-week indoctrination course."
I've got the books here, Dave. I'll send them to you if you really want to read them. But like, they're okay. They're just all the standard stuff you get in every other course. So I have a twirly one for you. Where's my twirly question? It's from Matthew Jackson. I'm going to copy this one because that's actually quite a long question. Matthew, apologies, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to be fancy. No, I've mucked that up completely. One moment, everybody online. Let's try it this way. So I've got a fancy button I can press. Oh, here we go. Look at that. So Matthew says, how do you set up a distributed human feedback network within government organizations who is adverse to experiments and wants to make a decision by committee rather than spending time with those that need new solutions to learn from them and adapt? There's quite a lot of questions like this. There's about 5-6 questions that are very similar. Okay. People who don't want to do it this way.
High level answer, right? At the end of this week, there's a new publication come out, which is a field book to managing in complexity and chaos, which is a joint publication of the Cynefin Centre and the European Union Scientific Centre. Okay? So that's coming out from the European Union. And one of the key things it talks about is creating human sensor networks to give you real-time feedback loops in a crisis. Yeah. So there's a whole method around how you do that, right? And you don't do it by telling people that they should stop making decisions in committee. You do it by saying we need to get better data into the committees.
Yeah.
And that's how you do it. I mean, this also links in with the work I did on counterterrorism in the States, where we were looking at, and I'm now going to really upset cybernetics people, but I'm being regularly mobbed by the cybernetics fanboys at the moment because they realize they're going, right? You have to be able to reverse Ashby's law. The key problem in counterterrorism is in reversing Ashby's law. So Ashby said only variety can match variety. And that means that if you've got terrorism, the state has to throw so much resource at it, the terrorist has information advantage. Now, the way you reverse that is you use your own citizens as a sensor network.
Yeah.
So one of the things we've been doing experimentally, for example, in Sweden, in Wales, in Colombia, in Egypt, in Afghanistan, is to actually use school children as ethnographers on a monthly basis as part of a school program. Yeah, to actually gather stories from their community in quantitative form. So you can actually see attitudinal maps of your people in real time. And then you can activate that network to ask questions in real time. And we're linking that in with citizen assemblies and citizen juries, where we did the first pioneering work on that. So that's how you do it. You don't sell it as an alternative. You sell it as an addition, which will provide huge value. And then you let the system adapt. And the question, Matthew, so I'm picking a point. The problem with the question is it assumes there's an engineering answer. I'm giving you an ecosystem answer. Yeah. Create a different information flow and then see what happens. Don't try and design too much in advance.
Yeah. And I totally agree. So one of my biggest things and problems I have with the agile industry as a whole is they have the solution already.
Yeah, and then they talk about an agile mindset. That's a classic problem. It isn't working.
It's cognitive dissonance 101, right? Yeah.
And we just to come back to Matthew's question briefly, that if you keep an eye on the website, there's a new Cynefin Centre website going up, because this field book is from our not-for-profit section, which I run. Yeah. So that's going up at the end of the week, and there will be some fairly massive briefing sessions over the next month on the field guide, right? And it's basically 4 simple stages: assess, adapt, accept, transcend, on how you actually manage complexity in a crisis. And that has a lot of the methods and tools. And the big thing we're doing at the moment is to put all of the methods into open source. So we're deliberately putting all of our methods into an open source wiki, rather than having them behind firewalls. And that's going on in parallel.
Can I get that link from you as well? And I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for that. There's very, very similar questions to Matthew. It's obviously a big pain point of people. How does complexity thinking fit into public organizations? How do we get people to deal with change when they don't want to change?
Let me give you a very simple message, right? In complexity, what matters is interactions, not things. So you stop talking about people and you talk about changing interactions.
Nice.
Right. So what you do is you pick off the intractable problems that traditional solutions haven't solved, and you put in something which might give civil servants better information. Yeah. I mean, we did a pioneering one in New Zealand some years ago, where we actually showed that over constraint to the tax system meant you got more fraud. And the New Zealand Tax Office changed their position accordingly. We didn't go in and say, you're getting this wrong. We said, we've got a better way of getting information about what's really going on. And I think that's how you make change in government.
That's actually what we do. Funny enough, I'm consulting at the moment with Ministry of Social Development, and we do a lot of reporting around the COVID and unemployment. And instead of arguing how we should do it this way, we should do this solution, this implement safe, this not implement safe, my teams just look at new ways of showing value and let the results show. The results show themselves, and then everyone goes, "That's a really cool idea. Let's do that."
You can look at what we did in South Wales, all right? So we did a project in the valleys, which you've got 3-4 generations without employment there now. And what we did is we used children from sports clubs and from schools as ethnographers to gather narratives. And then we did what's called transgenerational pairings. So young people could be trained how to use the software if they brought somebody from their grandparents' generation with them, and they worked as a pair. So, and that was based on science, because we took, people are not very innovative between their early 20s and their late 40s, I'm afraid. The innovation is very young and very old, right? So we put them together. And if they came up with a novel idea, they got put into a trio with a government official who could make the idea work. And that produced micro interventions, which had a massive economic impact, but not one single big program. And that's the stuff we can now scaling out.
That's beautiful. I really like that. That could be trialed in so many organizations.
And I like that a lot. What you do. You've got to eat your own dog food, as they say, right? In a complex system, you have to deal with things as they are, not how they should be. This is one of the big differences. Everybody else starts off with how we would like to be and tries to close the gap, and that never works. In complexity, you say, what's possible in the present? What can we change next? And that's a very different psychology.
And I will fully admit, because I am a consultant, that's what I do. I class myself as a business agility consultant, and that's how I make a living. I have to put a 3-year vision. I have to have a 90-day strategy, and I have to put those things to an exact.
I can send you a software platitude generator, which will do all of that for you, right? I mean, all you want is a good collection of platitudes, which could look on a whiteboard, and then you've got a vision, right? And if you really want to be fashionable, you call it a purpose statement. The guaranteed way to be purposeless is to have a purpose statement.
We do slightly more than what Michael Wardley jokes about in his TED talk, but it's a ambiguous end result, because we know we're never going to get there.
It's a camouflage activity. You know you've got to do it, so you do it. All right. The reality is always going to be different.
Yeah, 100%.
Take away some of the camouflage because it's wasting too much value.
Yeah, I agree. Because we are running out of time, so I'll just do the last question on here, because we didn't even get to Wow, Dave, we obviously are a bunch of similar minds talking for an hour. But I'll do one more question we have here from Sergey. What might have changed in Dave's view over the last 10 years or so, how the Cynefin framework can be applied across organizations undergoing change?
Okay, the big change of the two which happened last year and this year is realize that liminality is more important than domain. It's the state of imminent transition, and start in the central domain, don't start in the subsidiary domains. Those are the two big differences.
That makes sense. Do we have any other questions online that are like burning in your mind, guys? Because I'll try and intertwine them in the last 5 minutes. So I know your time is very valuable, Dave, so I don't want to keep you over time. But I will go. I will just quickly, while they're thinking of their questions, I'll give you my thoughts on the Cynefin model. Because when we first spoke on LinkedIn, framework, sorry.
It doesn't seek to represent reality. It's a sense-making framework.
Sorry, yeah, my apologies. The framework. And how I've used it for the last probably 2 or 3 years is I've tried to use it as a way of explaining to organizations where their current state is and therefore which approach makes sense. So what I've done is I've overlaid your work with Frederic Laloux's work of amber, orange, green environments, right? Culture. And I've said to myself, right, this makes sense. In an amber environment, command and control, hierarchies, efficiency-based systems, right? I love this. This is great.
About the worst book ever published.
It's not the worst book ever. There's a safeguide, right? Come on.
No, actually, no, the Croc's book is worse because he's a religious thesis seeking evidence to support it. So he only takes the aspects of the case which support it. And it's also based on one of the worst pseudosciences ever, which is spiral dynamics. Yeah, which is just nonsense.
What's wrong with spiral? Okay, that's a whole different conversation. Michael and Dave go at spiral dynamics.
Graves' original research was only done on his own students, which doesn't count. And even then, that doesn't transcend to levels of majority in society. And don't get me onto Ken Wilber and cults, all right? If you want to join a cult, start to become a teal organization, and sooner or later you'll be drinking the orange liquid in the jungles.
Yeah, I'll agree. For instance, I don't believe teal organizations even exist. I think it's a fantasy that we've created to create the next layer. But go back to fundamentals, though. Amber, if we agree that it's about efficiency, it kind of suits complicated natures. So what I've kind of devised in my head, it's just my head, is going, right, if it is complicated, therefore we are amber, therefore this is the culture we currently sit in an organization, and to trial, if the industry is going to complex, then we need to move our culture to more of a objective, focused, trial and error system.
If you abandon the colors, it makes sense. I remember famously at one conference, Beck said I didn't understand him because I was angry blue. So I had badges made, proud to be brown, and got the whole conference to wear them the next day.
Oh, brilliant.
And basically said, brown isn't a color. And I said, I'm just making the point, right? You really need to be very careful of any linear progressive model, because it means you don't understand complexity once you take a linear model up.
Yeah. Although I'm going to take your oscillation feedback, because I feel like that actually helps my case study. I've got a 3-year study in place, Dave, and I'd love you to read it when I'm finished. Colot Miles says, Kia ora, Dave.
Always looking for material for the blog.
Look. So I've got one published article so far on customer value, restructuring organizations around customer value. I've sent it to you if you would like to read it. It's probably very basic compared to your stuff, but that's my first lot.
Now, the blog is my main medium. I much prefer blogging to anything else.
Yeah, I must admit, I wrote 22,000 words and I had to cut it down to 4,000. That was fun. Looks like there's no more questions on the line. I say Colot said hello. Sergey says thank you, Dave. Elizabeth says good old systemic theory, Dave. Sorry, my reading's terrible. It's a shame you can't join me for a wine, Dave. When you're in Wellington, come join me for a wine.
I'm on the copy at this stage, yeah.
Yeah, and that I totally understand. That's totally fine. What you just described is variety, which is what Ashby's law calls for. You agree that variety doesn't equal complexity, right? Ooh.
No, I think you need to reread that. The issue is to reduce the variety of your response to match increasing variety of stimulation. That's the goal on reversing Ashby.
Okay. I haven't read it, so I can't comment on that one. Could you please repeat the book's title? Oh, Anastasia, sorry, I missed that. I don't remember what book we were talking about. If it was my book, my amazing book by Frederick Lowe, it's called Reinventing Organizations. It's actually a great book.
And one of the two worst books ever published in Agile, with the least basis in any valid research. Yeah. You're better off reading the Bible, to be honest. It's got more precedent.
There are way worse books. We could have a whole hour on the worst books of Agile with no objectivity.
And we do have to finish because I'm meant to be hosting another call. So.
we are. Thank you very much, Dave. You get going. I'll message you later on, and I'll sign off everybody else here. Thank you, Dave. For everybody else, howdy. Just me. I hope you really enjoyed that. We only had an hour of Dave's time. I know there was so many questions. I wanted to dig deep into a whole bunch of those things. But say la vie. I hope you got a good experience from this. This is Agility Matters. We focus on adaptive organizations that respond to customer needs, and we are flexible in our approach to agility. Any questions for me? Feel free to post them now, and I'll answer them best I can without Dave. Or just kia ora and good night. Oh, and my wine tonight was the 19 Crimes, 2019 Shiraz, South Australian wine. For the Kiwis in the group, you're probably going, another Australian wine. Yeah, another Australian wine. But I'm still looking for recommendations for a New Zealand Shiraz. Come on, guys. So there was a question I can answer, I saw, from, where was it? Sylvani Kotong. What does agility really mean? How does it materialize? So like agility to me, I think I said it before, it's the ability for an organization to adapt to their environment, respond to customer needs, and be flexible in their approach. So I stick to a lot of the academic research. So you've got likes of Day and John, great researchers to look at around agility. And they focus on those three components, an adaptive organization, a responsive organization, a flexible organization. And if you remember those three things, they're the key ones. We focus on 4 values of business agility. You don't need to worry about them, but we focus on a way on measuring agility and therefore being able to get yourself there. And I'm saying this now Dave's gone, because he'll probably go, that's an absolute pile of nonsense. But I personally have seen case studies achieve more business value, more customer value, more employee value this way. So, and as I say, at the end of 3 years, we'll have a good case study for this over many organizations. But we've got strategic agility over strategic planning. So the ability to adapt to your environment as opposed to be focusing on a 3-year set of goals. We have cognitive diversity over specialization. So we've gone from this system where we think about specialized roles and silos to where we need cognitive diversity. We need all the skills that we need to deliver a feature or a product together, working collaboratively, including the customer, by the way. I'm a big fan of the customer. Then we've got employee empowerment over hierarchy. So trusting the knowledge workers that they know what's best, and it's not actually we as leaders, we know best, because we don't. And this is the problem. A lot of you made some comments around agile coaches. I totally agree. And if you've been on the show before, you'll know that we don't hold back on agile coaches. We will push them and say, stop with your dogmatic beliefs, because that's not the point. And you even heard Dave there mention the exactly same thing. And they're kind of the values that we focus on. Oh, the last one is customer centricity over product centricity. So the customer is what's actually important. As you heard Dave say, Apple, they focus on the customer ecosystem. They didn't focus on their products. They didn't drive the strategy towards commoditization. They focus on customer experience, customer satisfaction, which means they adapt to their environment. Matthew Jackson, I find that people don't like being in the liminal state. No, they don't. No, they don't. It's very true. It's very true. And great question, Matthew, earlier on, by the way. That was a great question. Quite a few people had asked Dave about the link for the field guide in different talks. I don't think the link's available yet. No, so he said the link's not available yet, but he's going to forward it to me and I'll put it in the show notes. I'll try and put it in the meetup group as well, and that'll help you guys there. How often could you take an organization internationally into a state of chaos? I won't answer that, Matthew, because I think that's a question for Dave. I'd love to answer that, but he'll probably watch this and send me a whole list of things why I said was wrong. So I'll send some of these questions to Dave anyway and see if he'll answer any of them. What is about Dave's book? What is about Elizabeth? What does that mean? What is about Dave's book? Do you mean what was the other book he doesn't like? He didn't say, did he? He didn't say. I don't mind Frederick Rouleau's book, by the way. It is a people book. It is not designed for scientific literature. It is designed to connect the dots between culture and how things portray in your organizations. I'm a little bit of a fan. 27 people remaining. So feel free to ask any questions, or if it's just casted to your screen and you wait for me to turn off, I won't turn off. I'll keep on going till you guys are out of questions. Oh, the title of his books, Alberto. Yeah, no, totally true. Actually, let me remind myself, I'll put a link to all of Dave's books and his free books and his blog in the show notes as well. Good point. Yeah, Elizabeth, yeah. I will find it out for you and get that done for you. Cool. All right, well, if we're all out of questions, thank you very much. We had 71 viewers tonight, so that was good fun. Have fun, trial and push the agility forward, guys. Be adaptive, responsive, and flexible in your approach. And I'll see you guys next week. Next week, we actually have Chris Tuhoy. He was involved in the Spark organizational agility transformation. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about his transformation of Spark, which is obviously one of the larger companies in New Zealand. Until next week, guys. Kia ora.